This is a dramatic story. We may have heard it before, possibly many times. For those of you who are familiar with this story, I'm certain that you have heard many varied focuses pulled out of this text. It's not only a dramatic story, it's a recurring story, playing out in various cultures throughout history because it contains a universal theme that is repeated by humanity. See if this scenario doesn't sound familiar. Let's consider Herod, this Herod you read about, Arvel, the ruler. It seems like he, for all intents and purposes, dominates this story. We observe Herod's guilt because John the Baptist has called him out over his lifestyle. And that guilt then leads to paranoia. Quite predictably, guilt and paranoia are followed by fear of being exposed. Above all, Herod does not want to be exposed as weak, and definitely not before his subordinates. But this powerful ruler has an Achilles heel. It is Herodias, whom he, according to John the Baptist, has married unlawfully. When a slighted partner comes under scrutiny, there's no telling what will happen. And happen it did. After Herodias' daughter, that is Herod's stepdaughter, has danced before the guests to the delight of the ruler, who is now Herodias' husband, Herodias pressures her daughter to channel her own thirst for revenge. This delightful dancer is to ask for her mother's nemesis' head on a platter. In other words, Herodias unceremoniously orders an execution. Seems that they also dealt with nepotism in their day. Herod, the ruler, succumbs to the pressure. Why? Well, he wants to save face in front of his guests. No matter that initially he was afraid to arrest Jesus because of fear of John's followers, because they held him to be a prophet. If any of that sounds familiar, it's not surprising. Narcissistic personalities cycle through history and cultures as predictably as autumn turns into winter. This sermon could also be entitled, When the Powerful Are Not Powerful at All. But that's another part of the story. Did you notice how this reading ended? The last line that Arvel read, did you catch that? Here's that sentence. When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Last week, in the context of various seasons of human life, I mentioned hibernation, a time to cocoon and to refuel for another season. And that is exactly what Jesus did here. Imagine with me, Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. And not only that, they were friends and colleagues. John the Baptist had been instrumental in launching Jesus on his ministry. Both of these leaders had considerable followings. In the course of being faithful to his call, John found himself caught in the tentacles of a ruling octopus, so to speak, with one of those tentacles feeling personally singled out for negative scrutiny. Even without the benefit of social media, Jesus had heard about John's imprisonment. And then he heard about John's brutal execution. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, this will have brought a rumbling foreboding in Jesus. Given the intolerance of the ruling regime, Jesus knew this would place a much more visible target on himself. Jesus had options. He could have met this targeted assault head on, going on the visible and verbal offensive to condemn unjust overreach. Isn't that what a strong leader would do? Wouldn't it actually have been his responsibility? The other option is he could cocoon, wrap himself in silence, solitude, sacred presence. Some would call this retreat, which has a militaristic overtone. I call it cocooning. This kind of cocooning is the practice for the sake of self-regulation and gaining divine perspective. And for Jesus, at this point in his life, it was also a way to work through his terror and his grief. This is critically important. People are vital when horrible things happen and when there is grief. Equally crucial is time spent alone in silence. This allows us to feel, to breathe, to call out to the divine, and to regulate our nervous systems. It is something we all can learn, and we should learn it. Given our text, cocooning, solitude, and still notes are the footnote option. The footnote option is how spending time in silence and solitude is often represented in the historic Christian faith. That is, not central, unnecessary, and almost invisible. Everyone knows you can save a lot of time when you just skip over the footnotes. But I contend that stillness is treated as a footnote because this is how it is documented in Scripture. Could it be that it is because Scripture has been interpreted and been translated and retranslated by men who had proximity to power, or rather those who were actually commissioned by those in power? It could also be that silence and solitude are unpretentious, non-definable, devoid of any discernible action. Cocooning, or stillness, cannot be exploited nearly as easily as a call to action. It isn't easily driven by fear, and its fruits are not marketable. Jesus intentionally stepped outside of the fray and regularly prioritized stillness without feeling the need to explain or defend it. I challenge you to read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and ask yourself, what sentences have I never noticed before? And why have I not seen this before? Why is this not front and center? What would change in you, in our congregation, in our world, if we were to place emphasis on footnote options? I wonder how often our footnotes point to emphases or people who represent the margins, forgotten spiritual practices, actually reflecting the very essence of what the Christian community is called to be. That would be a transformative study. It's ironic that we are still communities in which there are it is ironic that there still are communities in which stillness is important. It is not a footnote. It represents the very fiber of their being. While this happens on the fringes of the Christian faith, it is not held as a pillar of practice. One of those communities that honors stillness is the Native American community. The following is a passage written by Ella Deloria, whose name is also Beautiful Day Woman. And Deloria was a Yankton, Dakota Sioux educator, anthropologist, ethnographer, linguist, and novelist. She recorded Native American oral history and contributed to the study of Native American. And here is some of what she wrote. I quote, "We Indians know about silence. We are not afraid of it. In fact, for us, silence is more powerful than words. Our elders were trained in the ways of silence, and they handed over this knowledge to us. Observe, listen, and then act, they would tell us. That was their manner of living. With you," meaning the non-Native Americans, "it is just the opposite. You learn by talking. You reward the children that talk the most in school. In your parties, you all talk at the same time. And in your work, You're always having meetings, and everybody interrupts everybody, and all talk 5 or 10 or 100 times. You call that solving a problem. When you are in a room and there is silence, you get nervous. You must fill the space with sounds. So you talk compulsively, even before you know what you're going to say. White people love to discuss. They don't ever allow the other person to finish a sentence. They always interrupt. For us Indians, this looks like bad manners or even stupidity. If you start talking, I'm not going to interrupt you. I will listen. Maybe I'll stop listening if I don't like what you're saying, but I will not interrupt you. When you finish speaking, I'll make up my mind about what you said, but I will not tell you unless I don't agree with you, and then only if it is important. Otherwise, I will just keep quiet and I'll go away. You have told me all I need to know. There is no more to be said. But that is not enough for the majority of white people. People should regard their words as seeds. They should sow them, then allow them to grow in silence. Our elders taught us that the earth is always talking to them, but we should keep silent in order to hear her. There are many voices besides ours. Many voices. End quote. Whew, that hit close to home. There are many voices besides our own. This does not negate our voice, or our Christian tradition for that matter. It simply gives another avenue by which to understand ourselves, humanity, the divine, and our earth. And especially at this point in our national history, a time of polarization and loud, demeaning voices, we need to find healthy ways to come together, not to compromise, not to endorse positions that contradict our own values. To move toward a position of coming together, we must learn to still the inner dialogue long enough to connect meaningfully with those who are different from us, yet those who share our spaces, those who represent maybe up to half of the population, and those you might share a Thanksgiving table with. We must remember the wisdom of our indigenous siblings who know the value of listening and stillness. There are other communities in which stillness is sacred. We can learn much from people like Tara Brach, an American psychologist, author, and practitioner of Buddhist meditation. And for those of you who may be startled by bringing Buddhist meditation into a Christian reflection on a scriptural text, may I just remind you that Buddhism is not a religion. It is a set of practices to help make our own faith more vibrant, more practical, more down to earth. Ms. Brock speaks about identifying our own inner divides. The times we vacillate between opinions or change our minds for reasons that we don't even understand ourselves, just like we observed with Herod in our text. Here's how she describes this need and this process, and I'll paraphrase this because it's a longer quote. You need to be able to bridge your inner divide before you can start trying to bridge others. And I insert here, isn't this what Jesus talks about, taking the plank out of your own eye before you try to take that splinter out of your neighbor's? But back to Brock. She continues, we've lost our sense of belonging to each other. And when we lose our sense of belonging to each other, we're also not connected to our inner life. The more trauma there is in the world, the more the survival brain takes over and it hijacks us. We have so much unprocessed fear that we disconnect from each other. But more importantly, we become disconnected from ourselves. So when we ask, How are we ever going to begin to be in the same room together, to see the humanity in others, to find our way to more peace on this planet? We will first need to sense what is happening within ourselves. End quote. Ms. Brock says a whole lot more about this, but what she presents as a way to find personal community and broader healing cannot happen on the run. It must take place in stillness, alone, in the cocoon. So where do we go from here? What does all of this mean, remembering that there is a season for everything? There are many facets of living faithfully today, tomorrow, next week, and moving onward. There is a time for action and a time for waiting, a time for growth and a time for dormancy, a time that takes us into the public square and a time we are called to cocoon. Today we have highlighted stillness as being a sacred practice, the cocoon as being a sacred space, and solitude as promoting sacred self-regulation. We cannot replace stillness with discussion groups, though they're valuable. Arguments or trying to convince others to be like us or even to understand us will not heal us. We can't even circumvent stillness, choosing rather to internalize great content that we find online or in our libraries or on YouTube channels. There is no substitute. Stillness may seem like a footnote option, but it is the pathway to our own unique, personalized divine gift to heal our own inner divide and then find wisdom to take it outward. Let's not miss these footnotes